ISO Productions presents another instructional video tutorial from ISO FileMaker Magazine, the professional's resource for FileMaker know-how.
Well, hello there, and welcome back to yet another FileMaker tutorial video learning more about FileMaker Pro. My name is Matt Petrowski, bringing you these tutorials over at FileMakerMagazine.com. In this particular video, we are taking a look at the topic of dynamic menu system. This is a flexible menu system, and it comes without the overhead. And what I mean by overhead is that in FileMaker, in the past, a lot of developers tend to add a lot of things to their schema, that is, to their fields, to their tables, basically to their database in order to facilitate things within the user interface. So your objective as a FileMaker developer is to make things as clean as possible in terms of their implementation, but as well not to commingle a whole lot of things within your schema in order to facilitate things happening in your user interface. So let's take a look at the file and see what we have going on. Alright, so let's take a look at the file. Here we have in front of us is just your standard FileMaker technique file that I provide with many of my videos. However, when I go into define database, I want you to recognize that this technique in particular has 0 fields. And in fact, when we look at the tables, I could very well just delete the default 1 table that came into this solution. There is really nothing going on with regards to relationships, as there are no fields to actually do any connections. So the key thing here is that this menu system that I'm going to show you deals with using global variables, but it does it in a very creative way that makes it dynamic. And what I mean by dynamic is that all of the menus can be generated on command based on where the user is at, based on what needs to display in terms of the menu. This applies also to access. If a particular set or group of users is supposed to access one type of menu or certain menu commands where another group is not, you can definitely do that with this particular technique. Now what we have right here in this middle area where you see this user admin and this Thursday, July 17th, this is what I'm calling the status area. But you can see that the icon that I have right here, this actually allows me to toggle the actual menu. Now there are many different things that you can do with regards to how you display this menu. The menu can obviously be static and always showing, or it can be something where you're multi-purposing. I'm using it for a multi-purpose behavior because I want to give you some insight. When you're working with limited space, say designing for FileMaker Go, you always want to figure out how can I repurpose this space and only provide things as necessary when needed. And that's exactly what this does. It attempts to use this area for the purpose of showing a status, and in my particular solution, I actually use it for 4 other particular situations, and that is for help, information, warning, and errors. Some of those are 4, or there's 3 of your most common messaging or user response types of feedback. You either need information, or you're going to warn the user, or you're going to tell them about an error. Or if you're going to supply some type of help information, you can do that as well. So I'm going to show you how I integrate that. I didn't in this particular technique file, but I will explain it in the remaining part of this video. So clicking on this little arrow, you can see reveals my submenu now. Now this is completely dynamic, and you can see that these are probably representative of areas that I would be able to head to in my solution. For example, if I clicked on people, I would expect it would take me to a people layout. But you can see right here I'm showing a dialog that says missing layout. I would target the layout number 30. Now what does layout number 30 mean? It doesn't necessarily mean the positional order of layout number 30. This is the internal ID, which we're going to learn about in the remainder of this video, which is very important when you're going to code things and you want things resilient so that they basically won't break. You can also see here that I can click on more. Now where these 2 menus would typically take me to a separate targeted layout, this one allows me to dynamically change the menu itself. I want you to recognize that there is 1, 2, 3, 4 menus, and when I click on more, if I click in this exact area, which I'm clicking as I move my mouse around there in that area, that button is no longer there, but yet these menu items using this exact same setup are here as well. And of course, I can click back and go directly back to the previous menu that I was at. Everything that we see in this area, everything in this whole area is completely dynamic. And that's what we're going to be taking a look at in the remainder of this video. Having now switched into layout mode, we can take a look at all of the moving parts that make this whole solution work. Now, right off the bat, you can see that the menu names themselves look nothing like what you might typically do if you're a newer FileMaker developer, or you're still developing in the way that you would, for example, go up to the toolbar, which I'm going to show by showing my status area, creating a menu. And I'm just going to call this one Dashboard. And in fact, even though I used text right there, typically I'd go out and I'd drag a button, and that button would actually perform a script. I'm going to set it to a variable, and I'm just going to call that dashboard. So here is our very typical approach to designing within FileMaker. We've got button 1, and then we've got button 2, and we simply assign each of these buttons to do different things, and we go up to the text and we rename them. Now, what makes this really limiting, aside from the fact that all the buttons are in their fixed position, which they are up here as well, is the fact that we can't dynamically change the names or the functionality of these buttons. We can't say that once we've performed a script here on this button, that we want it to perform a different script depending on what the content of the button is. That's a very common request. Well, that's exactly what this solution will do. Now, it's doing it with global variables, and you really can't do a whole lot in the UI if you don't use global variables. But the key thing to recognize about this whole system is that we're not thinking about buttons in terms of what those buttons are. For example, this first button is not my dashboard button. It is a navigation button in position 1. And if you approach a lot of the things that you do within FileMaker from the standpoint of an ordinal approach, basically our sequence of numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, in terms of their position, it allows you to do a lot of things in a much more dynamic fashion. So what I've done is, you can see right here, this merge variable, as I make a copy of this, this is an actual button. We can see that by looking over at the appearance, and we can see that it is an actual button object. But this button, using its text on top, is simply using a merge of a global variable named nav.1. Now, when you're doing things from an ordinal standpoint, having a suffix of an incrementing number makes things really easy, because a lot of things can be done with loops that simply just start at a given value and then increase as the loop cycles around. So we go 1 plus another 1 plus another 1, and we get our menu 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. Now, what makes this really nice by using these global variables is the fact that if a global variable does not exist, then there's nothing to actually show. So, for example, if nothing is in the global variable of nav3, but there is in nav2 and nav1, then of course these are able to show. So if you take a look at each of the buttons, you can see I've got this little, the eye icon, which in FileMaker 13, this eye represents the FileMaker 13 feature of being able to hide data, or hide an object, excuse me. Now, there are multiple objects that are hidden here, and in particular, you can see I've got these little arrows up at top. Now, these arrows are just a convenience feature, but they also have the eye icon on them. And all of this hinges on the fact as to whether or not there is a value existing within the value that's being displayed for the button. So if there's nothing in nav3, then neither the arrow nor the actual button will show because it's being hidden. You're going to find that under the Data tab in the inspector, and you can see right here that we have this calculation that basically says if, or hide the object when the nav3 is empty. And quite simply, this is just the same as it is for all of the other buttons corresponding to whatever name is on that button. So that should make sense to you. You should be able to say, okay, well, the hide when empty is nav5. The hide when empty, nav4. So everything is just a direct correspondence of whatever number that object is, that's what we're going to correspond to. Now, the name is really no big deal. The name is what's displayed on top of the button. But where we actually go or what we do when the button is clicked is something that we need to address. Now, before I actually do that, I want to point out that the flexibility of this system is really pretty nice, especially when you're developing a FileMaker Go solution. I want you to pretend, for example, that the length or the width of this particular object is 768. That's the portrait dimension for a FileMaker Go iPad application. If the user was to reorient the device by changing to landscape mode, it would then become 1024 in terms of its width. Well, there is nothing that prevents you from actually having a number of buttons that extend off screen that when oriented and in the longer landscape view, those buttons all of a sudden become available. Well, FileMaker provides a trigger for us that they provided in FileMaker 13 that when the user changes the orientation of a device, you can actually show or represent more of these buttons because this whole process is dynamically scripted. As well, any given button can simply add, as we saw, the fact that new buttons will appear. If I want to click more, I can simply change the names of all of those buttons and correspondingly change what they actually do. Now, I've hooked these up so that by default they are navigation buttons. They will take the user to a given location. Now, the easiest way to do that is to simply go to a layout by simply targeting that layout using the Go to Layout script step. You can choose the layout. If you change the layout name or do anything, that script step dynamically updates. However, because our menu is dynamic, we can't do that in this particular situation. We need to anticipate or come up with a system that will allow us to say, what menu do you actually need to go to? So what we're going to do is we're now going to take a look at the data viewer, and I'm going to show you how this actually breaks down. You've already seen that I started with this prefix of nav, dot, and then an incrementing serial number. So I've got 1, and then 2, and then 3, and then 4. Well, for any given one of that class, or what's known in a lot of computing, that this would be the domain. The domain is nav dot, and then 1 is the category, or where the, not category, but the position that this particular button is in. This is the first position button, second, and so forth. But likewise, I can add additional pieces of information which would be known as modifiers. So this dot layout now modifies the nav.1. So the nav.1, you can clearly see, has the value of dashboard in it. And I can simply change this at any time that I want to. I can change it to any value because that value is simply coming from a global variable. Well, the layout portion of this is actually the internal ID number of a layout. Now, the reason that I use the internal ID numbers is because these are values that FileMaker assigns behind the scenes, but FileMaker scripting does not provide us access to this unless we have a few custom functions that will do this for us. So as I hide the data viewer and go into my custom function dialog, you're going to see a number of custom functions in this particular technique file. Most of them are taken from the FileMaker Standards website, filemakerstandards.org, where all of our parameter passing is passed using these hash functions. And then for given objects using FileMaker's internal ID values, you need these object functions. And then you have some helper functions such as the script optional, script required, and so forth. The one custom function that is specific to this file is called setMenu, which this is where we're going to see how the actual menu can be set so that you have a corresponding list of the names of the menus that you want and their target values, which typically are going to be layout numbers, but don't necessarily have to be layout numbers, as we will soon see. So the first place you're going to see this is in the script of Initialize menu. So when your solution opens up, that solution is going to run typically a startup script. Now this particular startup script is in turn calling this script right here called Initialize menu. The Initialize menu, as we're going to see, is very simple because all that it does is it simply sets all of those global variables. That is all done within this one particular object right here of the menu was set. This variable is simply going to set all of the different menus, and depending on the number of items coming in, if the menu currently has 8 items set, but I was to set in only 6 items, that means that it's going to remove number 7 and number 8. In other words, it's going to kill or delete any menus that come in as a new list of objects. Now, this particular function, what makes it really flexible and powerful, is the fact that you can have as many items as you want, as long as you provide both the numerical value, which represents either what the particular menu item is going to do, or its corresponding internal layout ID. That's what we're seeing right here. You can see that initially I'm setting a variable called count of 50. Now, why am I actually setting the count of 50? That's because I'm wanting the custom list function, which is right here, a very powerful custom function by Agnes Barreau, which allows us to simply say, I want you to do this 50 times. That's in anticipation of the fact that if I ever had 50 menu items, then it's simply just going to create all of those different 50 items. If the values exist, they will be set. If the values don't exist, then they're not going to be set. So 50 is truly an arbitrary number. Given that I only have 5, I could put this to 5 and it would reduce the overall processing time, but we're talking about something that is just milliseconds. It's super, super fast. So it really doesn't cost me a whole lot to put this up at 50. Maybe a more realistic number might be 10 or 15, given that I'll never be able to fit any more across than my actual layout accounts for. So you can modify that to fit whatever your circumstance is. But you can see that we need 2 sets of information. We need the human readable names, which we can see right there using that list function that I have, dashboard, people, products, and then more. Now these are all in the order that they're actually going to appear. And correspondingly, you can see that this nav layouts variable is going to use the internal ID number of the actual layouts until we get to this value of -1. Now this is a little bit of computer trickery or programmer trickery that I'm using, in that all layouts and all of their IDs start in a sequential order internally from FileMaker's standpoint and simply increment. If you ever want to have a set of numbers that you can use in order to determine what you want to have happen, you can go in the opposite direction, obviously going away from 0. So I can use -1, I can use -2, all the way up to -99, anything that I want. I also could use a piece of text if I wanted to. I'm not limited to specifically using a number field because I can determine, which would just require additional calculation logic, is the value that I'm receiving, the script that actually is run when a particular menu item is selected, are you a number or are you a piece of text? If you're a number, then do this. If you're a piece of text, then do that. Now, what we have by setting these 2 list values is we have a corresponding map. This map of the name to the corresponding value of the internal ID, such as people to 30, which doesn't exist, products to 24. The only one that does exist in this solution is a layout internal ID number 2. And I'm accounting for -1 when the user selects on more. The way that we get these into the global variables in the easiest fashion is using this custom list function. Now the custom list basically just runs multiple different, or it generates multiple different let statements running whatever FileMaker function you want. This is what makes custom lists so absolutely beautiful. It's simply a FileMaker function interpreter on a frequency basis, like how many times do you want this to happen. So you can see right here that going from 1 to the total of count, which means for 50 times, I want you to use my own custom function of hash. Now hash is basically a custom function that simply creates a let specific variable. And what I mean by a let specific variable is something that simply looks like, actually, let me zoom back out since I wasn't in the specify dialog box. It simply looks like this. I want you to create a var equals something type of variable. This is all that this one function does. This little hash, it's a little helper function that creates one of these. So what custom list does is it simply takes this as input, and it says, I want you to create each one of these variables for each one of these pieces of information. And that's what it does. You can see right here that we've got the nav dot, and then the custom list, the way that it uses its ordinal value, its number, is with this bracket in bracket. So basically what happens is this gets created, nav.1, and then the in becomes .2, .3, 4, 5, all the way up to 50 with the value that's included. So it's taking this value, using the get value, using a corresponding number. So number 1 is dashboard, number 2 is people, number 3 is products, and so forth. It just gets all of these values in their corresponding order, such as I've just double-clicked right there. Now I'm doing that within two of these helper functions called hash assign global. So as opposed to using the assign function, which simply creates local variables, that's the single $sign variables, the assign global creates the double $sign variables. This particular function of assign global returns a true or false value as to whether or not it was successful. You can see that by combining them with an and, I'm saying if you were able to successfully assign these globals, which are the names, and you were able to successfully assign these values, which are the nav layout IDs, then perfect. All of this will either return a true or a false. So in that regard, what happens is the menu was set can actually be checked. I could have some logic after this that would say something to the effect, if I wanted to trap for this, if not menu was set, then I could run whatever error code I want. This is what allows you to do what's called self-documenting code, meaning the code itself is readable. I can see, set a variable, what menu was set. If not menu was set, then do this. And I don't have to have a whole lot of comments. So without making the code much more complex, I wanted you to get the fundamentals. That's the initialization. Now all of that code right here can also be put into a custom function. And so I left this initialization here so that you can understand what's going on and also allows me to explain the code. But the easiest way to deal with this is to actually put it within a custom function. So the one custom function that is specific to this technique, which I mentioned as I bring it up, is this set menu right here. And when you take a look at this custom function, you're going to see that it is the exact same code, except that it takes an inbound name list and an inbound layout ID list. So it simply provides both of those to the assign globals, which in turn use the custom list and create those menus. So I'm able to actually use this one function quite easily with set menu. So this is where we can take a look now at the actual setting of the menu. Now the initialization happens on startup. We initially set our value so that we do have some menu items. The menu button is what actually gets clicked when you click on the button. But what we can take a look at is what happens when we do click the button. So let's take a look. We double click each of the buttons, and you can see that what's actually being passed to the menu button is an expected position. So we're basically just saying, hey button, what position are you? Are you button number 1, button number 2, button number 3, etc.? If that button knows what button it is, then all it does is within the data correspondingly go get or look at this value and correspondingly look at this value. It says if I'm in position 1, go get what's in nav.1. If I'm in position 3, go get what's in nav.position 3. The rest of all of the decision making is all up to your script. And that's where you can use your positive values for your layouts or your negative values for your actions, or a text value. It really completely is up to you. So taking a look at the script now, we can see, not the define database, but the script, the menu button. What you're going to see is you're going to see that this is going to run the target navigation script. So the position is a numerical value of the menu position. If I click on button number 2, what's going to happen is the script's going to run. It's going to filter out and get my parameters. If that's successful, it's going to continue and get a value and decide. It's going to set the value to use the evaluate function in order to evaluate the dynamic variable. So what we have right here is we have the position value that's coming in. So we're sandwiching that between the nav and the layout, which directly corresponds to the global variable that contains the internal FileMaker ID of a target layout object. If we evaluate that, then this value will be that ID. Now you can see right here that my comment says that layout IDs are always positive. That's because from the time that a FileMaker file is created, an internal ID is associated to each and every layout, and as that file grows, that simply increments, and it's never negative. This is what afforded me the opportunity to say, okay, if I assign a negative value to that menu button, or to the menu, and click on the menu, what do I want to do? Well, if it's a -1, then I can do something else. In this case, the something else that I'm doing is simply setting another set of menus. So it's completely dynamic. This allows me to change this menu even when the menu itself is clicked. This is what makes it so powerful. And here you can see I'm actually calling that custom function of set menu, and all I need to do is pass it those 2 corresponding lists. I want you to now show a back button, the another, and a menu option, and here are the IDs. And of course, using a negative value, I can see that if a negative value of 2 is actually received to go back to the original menu, then all I want you to do is perform the script initialize menu, which sets it to the original menu. Hopefully, throughout the course of both watching this video and just exploring the technique, you can see how truly dynamic this is. And it doesn't just stop at being able to do your English menus. This obviously means that whatever is in the global variables, that's what's going to show. That means your solution can also be localized to use whatever menus you want. So that's fundamentally how this whole solution works. There's only a few other things that you need to understand about what's going on. And this is also a beneficial tip in terms of FileMaker 12 and 13 in particular, especially since this deals with the web direct functionality. FileMaker, and having to refresh a lot of objects, was very costly on FileMaker Go because it would basically refresh the whole screen. It would start at the top and it would move all the way down, refreshing all of the objects that needed to be updated. Well, FileMaker provided a new script step in FileMaker, I believe it was in FileMaker 12, but it's even more important in FileMaker 13 now, that allows you to refresh just individual objects, only those objects that are actually going to apply. In this particular implementation, as I stated, I like to use or multi-purpose this area where the navigation buttons are, using it not just for navigation, but also for information, such as showing a status, or showing a warning, an error, or anything else that I could want to use. Now this is clearly seen by the fact that this object that's containing this, where I've dragged off to the edge, or I've extended it outside of the edge, and it's obviously its anchoring points. You can see right here within the anchor that the anchor points themselves are going out to the left and out to the right, that those are actually going, these tab controls are going to stay outside of the actual user interface. But you can see that as I switch between here, I could very easily put in a new tab name of like warn and then say OK. Well, this warn section now, I could very easily have within this a little warning icon. And I, of course, can target this warn tab object by simply just calling it tab.warn. And so if part of my script has hidden error and I need to now warn the user, I can go to the tab.warn and populate a global variable, give them that information, and I'm able to multi-purpose this one area for all of these things, for user feedback, for status, and then also for a menu. Now, in order to refresh this menu so that all of these hidden objects do hide when they're supposed to and everything is refreshed, I need to have a sequence that refreshes all of the objects that are affected based on what I click on. In fact, you can see right here in this area that I have this down right arrow and this up left arrow, and one of them, this one on top, is actually just a graphic. If we take a look at the Appearance tab, we're going to see that it is an actual graphic object. And if we look at the one underneath, we can see that it is a button. So the button, quite simply, is currently performing a step directly on the button, and it's simply toggling between all of the different, or between the two different tab objects. Double-clicking on this, you can see that it's using a goTo object. That goTo object code is basically just switching back and forth. It says if the tab menu is the front panel, then I want you to go to tab status. Otherwise, I want you to go to tab menu. So it's basically just a toggle between the two states. But you're going to see that here, as a result of my actual object right there, that little script trigger, when I double click on this, you can see that I'm using an onObject modify. So the onObject modify on my tab panel here says refresh menu objects. So when we take a look at that script, you can see that it simply is just going to have multiple refresh objects, all of which are the objects that are part of this whole system. They all have a part to play within this. So putting this object back where it goes, you can see that I click, I get my toggle on my arrows, everything refreshes, and I get this nice little arrow and all of these objects ready for me to click and use as a dynamic menu system. So there you have it. There is the core of a dynamic menu system. It basically all works just on an ordinal position of buttons and then moving values in and out of global variables that basically determine the direction that the script is supposed to take, as well as what the actual button is supposed to say on top. Using this menu system, you get all advantages in terms of controlling the whole navigation experience for the user and doing it in a very multi-purposed way by multi-purposing all of these buttons. Using your off-screen tabs allows you and extends your flexibility to multi-purpose the area itself of where the menu is set, and you basically have a solution that will work from a compact iPhone all the way up to your full display if you want to go out as wide as you want to go. So that's what I have for the dynamic menu navigation. I hope it has benefited you in terms of learning more about what you can do with FileMaker. As always, I'd like to wish you much luck with your own FileMaker database, and until next time, happy FileMaking.
We hope you've enjoyed this video tutorial, and we'd like to say thank you for your subscription and your support. If you're not already a subscriber, head on over to www.filemakermagazine.com/subscribe for more information about the benefits of joining.